So today's guest is KethyBennet, and she'll be talking about Agile project management and organizational change management. And so Kathy, I'll go ahead and hand it off to you and take over.
All righty, well, thank you. So to tell you a little bit about myself, my background, I have a career in information technology and also higher education teaching. And from IT perspective, I've always been on the application side of the world. So I'd be working with business partners who would come to me with a problem or an opportunity that they saw we could satisfy through technology. So I've worked at organizations like GE, Schneider Electric, NKU, and then I've also taught over at NKU. And then from an education perspective, I grew up in Cincinnati, and so my bachelor's and MBA is from Xavier. And then while I was working at NKU, I wanted to learn more about organizational change, and I saw that they offered a master's program. And so I took that program. And so currently I am a program manager at a startup organization, MRI Online, which is doing a continuing education for medical professionals. So that's a little bit about me. And what we're going to talk about today is back a few months ago, I don't remember what month it was, Marcy did a presentation about design thinking, and there were some references to Agile in there. So we're going to kind of tie that back together a little bit, talk about Agile and Waterfall methodologies, and then also talk about organizational change management. So Marcy, this will kind of look familiar. So she had, towards the end of her presentation, when we were talking about design thinking, talking about how innovators were looking at the next step and seeing where design thinking fit within the Agile framework. So being design thinking, exploring, Lean was building the right thing, and Agile building the thing right. So there's some more information there. I'm going to link back to what Marcia provided as a source here, if you want to kind of look at that a little bit more separately. So when we're talking about Agile and talking about project lifecycle, you have your project lifecycle across the top, and then within the execute part is when you're doing your system lifecycle, and whether you're doing planning, analysis, design, implementation, maintenance, and support. And so that can be, this SDLC can be done in multiple ways. So for most of my career, it was done with Waterfall methodology. So we would go through and we would it's very document intense. We talk to our business partners and create a requirements document, have meetings with them. A sign off was a very big important thing in Waterfall methodology, making sure everybody agreed before we proceeded, and then we'd go to design. And it was very sequential. And until we had those sign offs, we then moved into development, and this kind of IT kind of went away. And we would go off and do all of our development. We do our testing, and then we'd bring the customers back in to do testing and then deployment. So there was a lot of time when we weren't necessarily really engaged with customers with Waterfall. So that's where, with the difference being then with Agile, and we're going to talk a little bit more in detail, but Agile is more cyclical and more interactive. And so that kind of helps in that the customers are engaged throughout. Because a lot of times what would happen, requirements would change, there'd be turnover within customers, there'd be technology innovations that would happen that we wouldn't necessarily be able to take advantage of because we were committed based upon what we said we were going to do earlier on. So that kind of affected what we were doing. So when we talk about Agile, what it's really doing is condensing that SDLC into an iteration or a sprint, generally 2-week sprints. So that's where we're developing, we're testing, all in that same time period. And the users and developers are working closely together, and emphasis being on working software and very much relying on face-to-face communication. And it also is an umbrella term, includes a number of different approaches or methods, where sometimes you'll hear Scrum, sometimes you'll hear Agile. So there's different things that are kind of considered under the Agile umbrella. And what you see too, when you're looking at Waterfall, when we were doing it the way we've historically done it, where we define and build and release, there was more risk because the value wasn't really seen until you got to the end of the project. Whereas the idea with Agile, and you're doing this iteratively, there's value being seen along the way. And there's also opportunities when you're constantly working with customers to see that, oh, we didn't understand what you meant and we need to step back, or, oh, there's been a, as they're engaged more, there's been a change in how we're doing business. So what we told you, 2 weeks ago, that's not really going to work. We need to kind of reiterate. So you find things out earlier with Agile than you would necessarily with Waterfall, because it wouldn't be sometimes until they got to the end of the project and they're testing that they're realizing, oh, there were changes and we didn't tell you. So to talk a little bit just what Agile looks like, there's roles that come into play. So there's the product owner. So that's someone that's on the business side. So they're understanding what's needed to support their business function, whatever it may be, marketing, sales, whatever it is. And then you have a Scrum Master. And this is different than a project manager. A Scrum Master is working to facilitate what needs to happen within the team. So they're working to, they hold the daily stand-ups, and they're looking to help remove roadblocks and helping to remove, helping make sure that we keep making progress. So then you have the stakeholders, and then you have all your Scrum team members. So that'll be, the developers, that'll be the QA folks. So generally an Agile team is about 8 people. It doesn't work out to have an Agile team that's much bigger than that. What people will sometimes do is they'll have a multitude of teams. So that makes it a little bit easier to function. And then the way it works is that the product owner has their vision. They create what's called epics, and then they create what's called user stories. So they're documenting things in smaller pieces of work. And then you go through and you have at the beginning of like a 2-week sprint, you'd have a planning meeting. And then every day there's a daily scrum. And there's just, they're about like 15 minutes long. And it's basically talking about each person, they go around, each person talks about what they did yesterday, what they're doing today, and any issues that they're having. So it's kind of a coordination of the team. And then there might be some spin-off meetings that happen, discussions that happen after that, but it kind of lines up everybody with what's going on. And then it sees where people are needing help. So then midway through a sprint, there'll be a meeting that they call a backlog refinement meeting. And that's where making sure that everything is set up before we get to the next sprint. And so anything that needs more details, the product owners can go back and get those details. So there's different things that are managed with Agile in terms of like a burn down chart and impediment logs. So there's different things that are different than you see in typical project management. And then you get to the end of the 2 weeks, and then there's a demo. So it's showing everything that has been accomplished during that time. And then they have a sprint retrospective meeting at the end where they're saying, okay, what went well during the sprint and what didn't go well? What are we going to do differently? And what I've seen is that with Agile, there's a lot more customer involvement, and there's a lot more visibility as to what's going on. So it's not that, IT or whoever is going off and doing things and people don't see it, because it's very visible at that 2-week demo, what happened, what was worked on in that last time period. And so makes for a whole lot of more transparency in what's happening than what you would see in the waterfall methodology. So that's kind of where I've seen it be a lot more productive. It is a huge change for an organization, because a lot of times when I was working with business partners, they had their main responsibilities to keep things running. And when they're working with us on projects, that was just kind of something extra. And so sometimes it was hard to get their time to assist with what you needed. And it would sometimes, well, it just automatically went there. I didn't mean to go there. Sometimes, they would delay. Oh, I can't, I've got too much going on. It's, I worked with finance customers. So it's like, oh, it's near end of month, it's near end of quarter. It's going to have to wait a couple of weeks. So you would have delays. And so with Agile, if you want to keep the teams moving, you really have to keep that momentum going. So the business partners really have to be on board with what their level of commitment is going to be to work with the teams in order for this to all work. And sometimes I think what organizations are finding is that they're doing kind of a hybrid, where they're sometimes introducing some of the Agile concepts, but not necessarily being completely all based on Agile methodologies. It's really hard to make that transition. Sometimes, Marlene, you talked about interviewing and looking at Agile. A lot of times, organizations will say we're Agile because they're just meaning we're moving faster. So you have to be careful when you're talking with people. What is really their definition of Agile, and what are they really doing? So that's just kind of a little bit of an overview talking about Agile. So I don't know if anyone's had any experiences with it or any other comments before I moved into organizational change management.
I'd just like to quickly comment concerning the use of Agile in the procurement world. I think the procurement and supply chain, with the onset of COVID, how many companies were caught off guard and they didn't have a lot of things in place, or their teams and departments weren't as robust as they could have or should have been. And so I think some companies, especially some of the larger companies, are finding value in some of the transformation that they're doing in using sort of this concept, a little different way, but similar concept, to do little sprints, if you will, in when they're doing procurement projects, or when even in how they're transforming the department to, everything from, I don't know, innovation kind of things to, how they check out the suppliers before they onboard them.
Yeah. It definitely would be different in another function in procurement, but my experience has been all within the IT world. But I can definitely see how it could work with procurement.
I see the value. That's why I wanted to join today.
Yeah. There's definitely value to be had. All righty. Well, then we'll kind of transition a little bit and talk about.
I had a question for you, Kathy.
Sure.
The process seems to be very, it seems to lend itself to the low-hanging fruit to get that up and going into production, and to kind of be able to report a win or some success. Do teams to look at? Do teams seem to look for that kind of thing to work on? And for the more complicated pieces, it looks to me like you could tend to, if the unfinished products could get into production, and that would end up being end user support issues.
Yeah, one good thing about with Agile, at least in my experience, is that when we would have the sprint planning meetings, the product owner, so the business, was really driving as to what things should get into the sprint. And then it was the team deciding how much could get into the sprint, but the product owner maintained the backlog. So they were kind of managing to make sure that, just that things didn't, just the low-hanging fruit didn't get done. If based upon what needed to happen, the technical team might jump in terms of making sure, they had to make sure that the infrastructure was in place for what was needing to be done in that sprint. So they may introduce and indicate we need to do some of these other stories before we can do some of these things. But I didn't really see where people were just pulling the low-hanging fruit to get done. So, but I understand what you're saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, Kathy, this is John. On as far as the scope of your sprint, would that be developed in the planning stage, or how does that, this is what we want to accomplish with this project. So the planning stage would set that scope, or how does that work?
Well, for the project, they would probably be looking more at creating like a release plan. So that would be looking at the bigger goals for the project. And then sprint by sprint, they would then be working on what they needed to accomplish to meet that release plan. So some organizations are doing continuous deployment, and they're releasing something, every time there's a sprint Other organizations know that multiple sprints have to come together before they have a product they can release. And so then that relates back to the release plan. But so it's between those two things that kind of control what the scope would be.
Okay. I think I understand, but it's mainly, I guess you're talking a little bit more of software.
And that's what I'm talking, yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder if anybody has experience with, I think, was it Marlene that had experience with procurement? Is that not right?
I do have procurement experience. I've just been noticing and reading and learning that more and more procurement departments and teams are starting to, especially those that are going to more of the, some of the more sophisticated ERP systems and analysis and metrics, and it's allowing things to be done not in so many, sequence of steps like the old method that Kathy was just talking about when they did the waterfall. There are a lot of things that you can do concurrently or together, but a lot of things are lots faster using some of this methodology, if you will.
Yeah. I guess the waterfall, it's sort of like, I remember doing like MRP or ERP training. It was like in waves, this group would do the training and then this group, I guess so. And that was the old, it used to take a year, 2 years to implement a system. So I guess that you can do it quicker by kind of like this method of sprints.
Yeah, you can do it, but if it's with ERP systems, it still takes a long time to get those implemented. There's just so much that has to be done to move from a one system to another. So it could still end up taking a couple of years. It just might be that it's in a multitude of sprints.
Right.
Kathy.
And usually the training was not the training was usually way ahead of when you needed it. And so then by the time you got to the task, you had to almost relearn,
Yeah. Yeah, it works out much better to have the training closer to when you're going to use it.
Definitely. Kathy, sorry. Does each user story equal one?
Oh, hey, man. Oh, you like my suit? Most functional vehicle out there. I got almost 300,000 miles on this one. To be honest, though, it's not half as many miles.
Oh my gosh.
Oops.
Sorry about that. I don't know what that was. But does one user story equal one sprint cycle?
No, it'll be a multitude of user stories.
In one sprint?
In one sprint.
Okay.
And so what they do is they, instead of trying to estimate that a user story is going to be so many hours of effort, they do something called a Fibonacci sequence where they assign points. And so then they pull off user stories based upon various point values and then see how many can fit into a sprint. And then that's when they're looking at their burn down chart, and they then determine what their velocity is. And they see, we normally have a velocity of XYZ for a sprint, and then that helps them in the next sprint in their planning to see how many user stories they can pull in, so that they don't pull in more than they can accomplish.
I see. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So just so that I understand what you said, Kathy, the number of user stories, or at least the content of the user stories, determines the content of what you're going to work on during that sprint.
Correct.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, but it'll be a multitude of user stories. All right. Well, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about organization change management. This is just a little cartoon showing you how everybody's real eager about change, but then when it gets to be personal, that they realize they need to change, then people aren't so keen on it. So what I found in my career, when I worked back at Schneider, we did a training on organizational change management. And being that everything that I was doing within IT was changing how people were doing, performing their jobs, where they would be doing something one way on a Friday, we'd implement a system over the weekend, and Monday it was going to be different. And so that's we started putting in methodology for change, and we would try to anticipate what concerns would be. We'd be making sure the communication, and I saw that that added a lot of value to what we were doing. So when we talk about organizational change management, the definition by the Gartner Group is talking about transforming an organization so it's aligned with the business strategy, and it's the human element in a large-scale change project. So it's not something that has been really visible or known. A lot of organizations wouldn't really talk about change management. They think it was just communication, and it's really a lot more than that. So it's talking about getting those results and getting groups ready, willing, and able to implement and sustain the new ways of working. So it's a lot about leaders communicating the vision and employees knowing what that means to them and being willing and excited about that, and showing that there's support for the vision, and then making sure that employees are trained and that they're able to do it, and that also there's measurements aligning with that to support the vision. So there's a lot of different methodologies for change management. And one thing that I found in my master's program that we did some studying is John Cotter. He's a Harvard professor, and he's authored a lot of really good books on change management, managing change. He saw that he was having trouble getting people to understand necessarily what it all meant. And so he then created a book that's written as a fable to kind of take more of a lighthearted look at it. And he's known for this 8-step model of change, where you're establishing the urgency, you're creating the guiding team, you're developing a vision and a strategy, you're communicating for understanding and buy-in. That's really important. And then you're empowering others to act, looking for those short-term wins, you're getting momentum and more change, and creating that new culture. So a lot of times when change needs to happen, when there's not an urgency established, people don't know why. Why are we doing something differently? What does it matter that why can't we do what we were doing before? So it has to be explained as to that we're making changes based upon what's happening in our industry, what's happening in the market, or whatever the case may be, that we need to make change. So this is just a really good model that I've found it's been helpful. So when we're talking about change, whether it's positive or negative, there's stress associated with it, because changes can have an impact. There's a process, and it's very emotional for people. So there could be a lot of different reactions to change. It could be ending, giving something up. It can sometimes be easier for those initiating the change. It was probably easier for us in IT in that this was our job, and we were being told we needed to make these changes. So we were driving the process. So it was probably a lot easier for us than the people who were on the receiving end of what we were doing. So it can also, create some resistance and conflict. One system that I was putting in place when we were moving from doing expense reporting in Excel and then putting a system in place that would have policies, we knew we were going to be changing the sales organizations. So there was going to be resistance as to how they were doing things before that benefited them, that we were changing, and we were changing policies. So it's a matter of, pulling out and understanding that resistance and then addressing it. And it sometimes can change the rules for success. So sometimes somebody that was very good at their job and understood what they need to do, and then all of a sudden we put in a new system and put in new processes and changes, then it's a whole new ballgame for them. So there's a whole lot of different reactions. And stakeholder analysis is part of organizational change management. So it's a lot easier if you're building commitment than managing resistance. So trying to pull people in, helping people be part of it, and people support what they help create. So involving people along the way makes a whole lot better for the end result. Because a lot of times if there's not communication, or if it's very high level, then people will fill in the gaps, and the rumor mill will start. And sometimes people have an impression that something's happening that's really not even happening. So the more communication that's done, the better off it is for people to then understand what's coming, and they have their input. So when you just kind of a little bit of a recap, when we're introducing process changes to technology, it's important to look at how fast changes can be made. Sometimes if there's too many changes coming at people at once, it's overwhelming. And the communication is really important. You're getting that buy-in and collaboration. It's all works to make sure that there's successful change management, getting all those pieces in place. So there's talking again about the emotions. When we're working with something we're familiar with, a system or processes that have been in place for 10, 15 years, there's comfort. Then when they hear, oh, we're changing things and there's some discomfort and uncertainty. And then as people learn more, then it becomes more positive. And that's where there's a commitment curve. So with your communication, if you're starting at the very beginning then of the project, talking about getting awareness and understanding. So you're getting people to learn more about it and communicating what we're doing and taking in what their feedback is as to what they're concerned about or what they don't understand. So you're basically working to get people moving up the commitment curve to engagement and commitment so that then you have support and people are understanding, people want to make it happen and see the value to the organization. So they have to keep making sure that we're putting in front of people the value for themselves, so the WIFMs for how it's going to affect them, and then also for the bigger organization or company. When you're looking at change acceptance, there's some people that'll jump right in and be early adopters, but then you also have some people that'll be hesitant and they'll slowly adopt it. And then there'll be some that won't resist, that won't accept it at all. And in some cases, based upon the change being made in the organization, if those folks aren't able to accept it and aren't able to work towards it, that's when there's sometimes people are invited to move on to new opportunities if they're not supportive of what the organization is trying to accomplish. And so then this is just kind of some different books that John Cotter has done. And this is the one I was referencing. It's a real short little read. This is another one. This is not by John Cotter. This is the classic one, Who Moved My Cheese? I'm sure a lot of you have heard of that one. This is a different one, also not by John Cotter, but this one is interesting, talking about how change gets started and then how it gets killed and how people resist so much that a lot of times you'll hear change management is not successful. A lot of projects aren't successful. And some of it goes back to how the project was led and how it was introduced into the organization, because it's very important in the stakeholder analysis to identify who's going to support the change, who's going to resist it, and identify strategies as you're dealing with all the different folks within an organization to make it come about. So these are just some other resources, some of the books that were part of my master's program that we used. These are a lot more involved. They're all good resources. And then in terms of certifications, you'll see if you're looking at change management positions, ProSci is a framework that is very much very well known. A lot of organizations will look for people that are certified in ProSci. And then there's also other methodologies. There's a company in Cincinnati called the Change Guides, and they also do training and they do certifications as well. And so that's another type of resource. And I think that's about all I had. So Marcy, I don't know if anybody had any other conversations. Have you had experiences with change management?
Not really, although we do talk about it in Lean Six Sigma in the curriculum. But that's actually at the beginning of the pandemic, I've had some conversations with Paul and Tassos about it's probably something we should kind of zero in on, because as the pandemic goes, the companies are shifting. Doesn't matter what size, whether it's a small mom and pop or a big corporation. And now, of course, we're hearing conversations about the workforce who have been at home. Half of them really like staying at home and are much more productive, while others are just itching to get back. So then the question becomes, well, how do we optimize that? You know, some of them want to stay home and they are high producing at home. We can now see it, while others want to be back in the office and they're high producers at the office. So that's major, major change. And so I hope that we have those conversations soon, see how we can help our corporate clients in that way. But yeah, it's interesting how
Yeah,
how
you have to really think about it.
Mhm.
Just like in one of the prior lunch and learns, Paul was talking about the survey that they were offering to organizations
Mhm.
and looking at their productivity. And one of the things that struck me was, if they're asking their employees to complete this survey, what is the perspective that these employees are going to have when they're being asked to do that? Are they going to view it that, oh, they're looking, it's towards the end of the pandemic, they're looking at, can they have fewer people? And so framing up what you're about to, embark on is really important before you just put something out there in front of employees, so that because they can respond differently based upon how it's framed to them. Because like you said, that trying to get the maximum amount of value from staff members, and some people are more productive at working from home, whereas others need to be in the office and be around people, and they can't deal with the distractions of being at home. So it's very much depending upon a person, how they work. So
Well, and there's also another aspect that was really not talked about, but we've lost 600,000 people nationally. And so, a large chunk of that is workforce people. So then
yeah,
not before the pandemic, there was um, a strain on not enough people in the workforce. Now we're probably guesstimating about 400,000 less, maybe 300, 400,000 less. And so, how are companies going to manage with that additional gap? So yeah, it's just it's very interesting to see how things are just rolling out in real time and how to react and lessen that reaction time. So it's very, very interesting.
One global company formed small groups of about 6,000 of their, I would say 100,000 plus employees, and got feedback from those employees in those small groups. But in addition to that, they sent out surveys to all of their employees to get feedback. And I guess they were very careful because they wanted the feedback. They wanted to know, do you want to remain remote? Do you want to come back to the office? Do you want a hybrid plan? And they've been very careful to work through, really carefully concerned and wanting to meet the needs of the employees, taking into consideration, are there kids at home, or, other family members in the whole situation. Then there's another company that's not global, but national. What they've done is they've looked at different work groups and career roles to say, okay, this team or these type of people, they need to be on site. So they need to be on site all the time. Or people that are in this role, they're not essential workers. Their role doesn't necessitate them having to be on site. They can be fully remote. And then, of course, taking into a little bit of consideration, some people that might want to do a combination have remote roles. So they have slowly started to roll out what's going to happen, I guess, starting in the fall. So I've heard both of those things from people inside of two different companies. And then other companies that just said everybody's coming back to the office. And then I've been on a webinar with a grocery store, an Eastern grocery store chain. They've totally done away with their corporate office. Everybody is remote, and that's the way it's going to stay.
I think some of it depends on whether organizations were renting space or whether they owned their own buildings. So if they were renting, then, oh, gee, here's a great cost savings. It worked out when everybody was remote. Let's just keep staying remote. Versus if they own their own building, they want to get people back there.
Yeah, I would prefer like the company dictate where how it works rather than being surveyed about it. Because I just get skeptical when if I get a question, well, do you want it this way or that way? And if I answer the wrong way, you're off the team. Not that cut and dry, but it's
Right.
like, an indication that you're not in the corporate think tank or space. So I don't know. But I like the second model, that when the company would dictate where you have to be rather than selecting it.
Yeah, I think it'll end up with a lot of hybrid,
Yeah.
where, people
Kathy,
may decide, I want to be in the office, 3 days a week and work from home 2, or whatever the case may be. People
There's
like that flexibility.
There's an added component in the bigger scheme is that, when everything shut down, pollution dropped. And so, as nations are talking about being more mindful of the environment, then do corporations take on that conversation? Well, we know, we have data that if our workforce stayed home, we're not contributing to the larger problem of pollution. So does it make sense to, as a company, are we taking a more green approach? And if so, what does that look like? So yeah, it's very much a Rubik's Cube where you're constantly trying to match up those colored boxes.
Yeah, definitely.
Hmm.
Guess we'll see over time.
So as we're coming up to the top of the hour, we're at 12:45. Any final questions or final thoughts for Kathy? Okay. Well, those of you who popped in late, our Lunch and Learns will be moving from Thursday to Wednesdays. Right now, we're not sure if the next Lunch and Learn is going to remain on Thursday or Friday. We're trying to gauge our guest speaker if they can shift, and we haven't heard yet. So we'll definitely announce in the newsletter what day it is, but then August moving forward, it will be on Wednesdays. So that's our latest announcement. And then if that's it, then I guess we'll say goodbye until next month.